Hey everyone, welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Ray Christner, and with me as always,
Paul Wagner.
And today we had an opportunity to do an episode where we were comparing two disorders and trying to look at the similarities, the differences, and try to untangle things.
Yeah. And, I think we were both a little surprised with just how tangled they can be. But also, if we really take our time, then we can tease apart most of it. Certainly there's some, I think, that just falls into a gray and we're like, I don't really know. But really working to differentiate, what does the neurodivergency of ADHD look like compared to the neurodivergency of autism? Similarities and differences. Yeah.
And for me, this episode, and I think going in it, of course, we were basing this off of something we saw about the overlap of symptoms. And so I knew there was overlap, but I think what was surprising to me as we talked through it was, man, sometimes it is really hard. And, when we see these overlaps, how easy it could be for clinicians to make a judgment one way or the other without, really doing our due diligence to kind of understand things a little bit better. So, yeah, I think it was interesting. I mean, I think that, again, kind of knowing that there was overlap was one thing, and then talking through it, I was like, wow, this could be really hard. And I think just simply seeing a diagram with it doesn't do it justice. We really need to be real thoughtful in understanding the overlap and the differences. What was for you this week?
It was something that you had said early on, and then I think it was just repeated throughout the episode, but just the value of getting granular with, with these. And if we're able to do that, we're able to then have a better understanding diagnostically of what's going on, whether it's, accurate identification of ADHD, accurate identification of autism, or the accurate identification of both. But also how that granular understanding really just drives effective treatment. And, we can be treating the wrong thing in the wrong way. One thing I like to talk about with clients is like, I don't want you treating a headache with a Band-Aid. That's just not going to be effective. Right. So let's make sure that we're matching what's most effective. And I think that granular understanding of this helps get us there.
Yeah, I think that's, I think the whole purpose of doing these kind of episodes is to recognize, diagnosis is hard. We say this in the episode, we can sometimes take symptoms and overdiagnosis and make an overdiagnosis. And sometimes we can take symptoms and assume they're due to one thing and not the other, and misdiagnose in the other direction. And, the more I think people talk through these things, the better I think we get at understanding individuals better. And so for those of you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Join us on social media or email us, share your thoughts. And even if you have some ideas of other disorders to compare and contrast, we'd be interested in hearing.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this practice in action episode, Untangling Neurodivergence.
So, Paul, today we're going to tackle something a little different than we've done before. And, today, doing an episode where we're going to look at two disorders and talk about maybe how they're similar and really how they're different, and why sometimes it's so difficult to differentiate the two.
Yeah. One of them, a familiar one here from the podcast with ADHD. The other one, I don't know that we've necessarily talked about specifically, but autism.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, two of probably the most prominent neurodivergent disorders that we're aware of. And I think a lot of times, they coexist. And, I think when we look at research, it gives us these really wide ranges that something like, 22 to 83% of individuals with autism also have ADHD. And what a wide range, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so how do we, really look at these and go, are they things that really do coexist? And I think for many people they do. I'm sure you've seen some people, I've seen some people. But then really where do they differ, and how do we kind of, look at these symptoms to see, is it just one or the other or both?
Yeah. And, I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, especially for those similarities, kind of goes back to that case conceptualization episode that we were talking about of like, so, hey, we're naming a symptom here, but really, I think in figuring out, how it's presenting, what is the impact that it's having? What's the purpose that it's serving? And so we can't just take the symptom at face value. But I think because, sometimes it's easy to get lost in all the symptoms, we might miss something or we might misattribute something. So, hopefully we can kind of come in here and parse things out. And, I think one thing I am wanting to say up here at the top is that there's I think a really good graphic. It's a Venn diagram that was the spark for this episode from, I believe her name is Dr. Neff. And she has a website, Neurodivergent Insights. And she has a few different of these Venn diagrams, but this was one that really stood out to us, kind of looking through the information, feeling like it's relevant. And so, if you're interested, we'll have a link up to the website as well, so you can see it for yourself. But just wanted to kind of go down and talk about this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, from an evaluation standpoint, something we get asked a lot, differentiating the two. So, definitely, I think timely. And maybe a good place to start, Paul, is, as simple as this is, let's talk maybe just briefly what the core symptoms are of the two. And we're going to get into a little more granular detail here. On the surface, when we think DSM-5-TR, autism's core symptoms are the ideas of, social communication and interaction difficulties, having restricted and repetitive behaviors, interests, and activities. So those are kind of the core that we see with autism. And then ADHD, the core being inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, and having those things having a functional impact on a child. So, I think what makes this an interesting topic is if we purely look at DSM, they sound like really different disorders. So you just look at those criteria and go, wow, these are, complete two separate things. But that's really not how they present. I mean, so let's maybe, where do you want to start? How about talk about maybe the commonalities?
Yeah, let's talk about the overlap here.
Okay.
And it kind of gets a bit tangled together. So, again, certainly check out that graphic. There's more on here than we're necessarily going to identify, but some of the ones that really kind of stood out for us. And one of the first ones was the idea of stimming. Traditionally, I would think of stimming more as a feature of autism, but it certainly is present for individuals with ADHD. But this is where that conceptualization part is so important, in recognizing what's the function behind it or how does it interact. But Ray, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the idea of stimming is really interesting because, we could take this conversation and really hit neurodevelopmental disorders as a huge whole here. But I think we see this kind of self-stimulation and stimming behaviors across most neurodiversities. Even intellectual developmental disorders, we'll see stimming behaviors. And I think understanding the fact that just seeing the behavior and what's manifesting isn't as important as understanding why the stimming's occurring. For me, I see, with autism, the stimming oftentimes is maybe for a calming reason, or it truly is stimming that maybe even has no purpose, that it's just stimming for the fact that that's something that their body repetitively does. And I think that's very different than I see with kids with ADHD, where their stimming seems to have a different underlying cause. So I just had a little guy in my office just last week who is 5 years old. We're looking at trying to figure out kind of why he's having some of the symptoms. And did a lot of stimming in my office, but it always was in this idea of excitement. Like he would see a new toy in my office, and it was almost like watching an explosion happen. Like you could see it kind of build up in him, and he got so excited and he'd jump up and down and his hands would flap, and his parents were like, yeah, this is what we see with stimming. And, so for me, my question is, when does that happen? Like, when do you see it? Like, let's talk about all the different situations, maybe over the last few weeks that you see it happening. And it was pretty easy in his case to go, okay, this is a kid that just can't contain the impulse of emotional regulation and excitement, where it comes out in this stimulating behavior. Looks very different than when I see kids who stim, that are on the autism spectrum and stim for different reasons, where it may not be as purposeful. So that's kind of how I see it. I mean, what about you, Paul?
I think certainly for that excitement feature, I do see it a bit more prominently for individuals with ADHD, or I think, and this is just anecdotal experience, but I see a greater variety of stimming from individuals with ADHD, where with individuals with autism that I've worked with, it tends to be pretty repetitive and a much smaller pool that we're kind of going from. And I guess as we're talking, like the other way that I tend to see it with ADHD is also as a function of focus. And so it's that's a great point. Trying to stimulate myself so that way then I'm able to attend to whatever it is that's in front of me. And really, like, I think that's where kind of this idea of fidgets came, fidgets as a tool or a resource, and fidgeting, is, I think, not in every aspect, but has a lot of features of stimming.
Right. Well, we know that fidgeting will activate the attention parts of our brain. Like we see that happen. It's interesting. I had a guy many years ago, adult, that I evaluated who it gave me kind of the best metaphor. And he said, and he would talk about, he would rock back and forth, and he was coming in he had ADHD. We knew that, but everybody kept saying, we think you might have autism, because he would rock back and forth in this kind of like steady motion. And I said, well, tell me about it. Like, tell me about the idea of rocking. He goes, well, I find that if I move back and forth, I can focus better. Like that little bit of movement just helps me pay attention to conversations. And he said, if I can't rock back and forth, if I'm in a meeting, I bounce my leg. And he said, I keep one leg. And he said, I know which leg it is and I do it. But he said, everybody's always like, oh, you're always doing these kind of repetitive things. That's a real different experience, But for him, I said, what a great coping, and again, maybe it got to a point where other people were noticing it, but when he was a computer programmer, and he's like, I do it when I work, and I get so much more done. Great, what a wonderful tool to use. Socially, people started pointing it out and made him go, oh, maybe I have something more than I do. At the end of the day, his stimming was ADHD related, though.
Yeah. And, again, that just the function behind it. And, and it's interesting. We can also make it functional.
That's right. Yeah, right. Absolutely. But I think that's the key. I mean, going back to the idea of case conceptualization, that's why we really have to have a deeper dive than just looking at simple symptoms and really kind of understanding them. And, while the manifestation of stimming might look the same, the reason could be very different.
Absolutely. Well, and that kind of maybe brings us over to another one of these overlap symptoms of ADHD and autism, which is sensory differences. And whether it's like hypersensitive or hyposensitive, or even just almost a completely different sensation than maybe other individuals experience. Again, I hear this pretty frequently from my ADHD clients, where traditionally I would think of it as more of an autism symptom. And so to hear that crossover there, I think it's an important piece, again, to distinguish like, where is it manifesting and how?
Yeah. And I think sometimes this one, maybe is a little harder to differentiate as a symptom by itself. In that, I've had some that, we kind of go through the functions and still for me, it might be a little cloudy of why it's happening. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's pretty clear. Some kids who are impulsive or hyperactive, they'll sensory seek. And, that's really common. I've had a number of people who, it's interesting because I always say that I never love the word inattention. I always think it's more sometimes hyper attention, where we're attending to too much, and where they never acclimate to situations. So they're very sensory sensitive. This is talking with ADHD, where they never acclimate to the fact that a furnace kicks on or a car drives by the building they're in. Sometimes even to the feel of their clothes, that they're attending to it all the time. Again, sometimes that's a little different than what we see with autism, where many times with autism, it's much more of, I think, a sensory aversion at times. Like I can describe it like that, or sometimes there's sensory seeking as well. But I do think sensory stuff's a little harder sometimes to differentiate.
Yeah. And I like how you framed that, where, it's not inattention, it's maybe hyper attention, but we're casting too wide of a net. And I maybe I've talked about this before. And if I have, I'll cut this part out. But actually in my office, it's a really big flashlight, and I'll write a variety of things on a whiteboard. If I'm working with students, I'll write like in the middle, teachers teaching a lesson, and then it's guy mowing the grass outside, people talking 4 rows behind me, me attending to that maybe pressured feeling in my stomach, or, either just different perception-based experiences. And the flashlight can regulate, and so it can really have a smaller beam and a higher focus, and it can then diffuse the light and cast a wider range at a more constant way. And I like to describe that with people because it's just kind of a cool visual, but, where I'm able to then say, okay, hey, if we're looking at, neurotypical individuals, they're generally able to regulate this better. So they're able to, where the bright light is, the other light is still cascading off, and they're able to have these tethers and make their way back much quicker and much more effectively. With individuals with ADHD, we don't really have this regulating sense. And so it's either really bright in one area, but it's really dark around it. So it's almost kind of like a laser pointer rather than a flashlight,
right?
Or it's this diffuse light where we're almost taking in too much all at once. And, most of my ADHD clients it's either I take in everything or my lens is so narrow that I'm not picking up anything else.
Right.
I think a part of that is that sensory sensitivity piece of it of, if I hear a noise, okay, hey, it's pulling on my attention and I'm shifting away. And so that's really, I think that difference that I'm seeing is like the function and the impact that it has on attention. Certainly there can still be aversions to it. Sure. I do think that there can be a hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity. But even that, I don't know that it's necessarily always an aversion, where for autism, I either sensory seeking or sensory aversion, but I don't necessarily know that I see it as a function of attention all that often.
Yeah, I think I love that kind of activity to just kind of give a visual to people. I think that's really good. And I think the other thing with sensory things that I just kind of add is sometimes we also have to differentiate them from a behavioral reason. And it's interesting. I see more and more kids that are for lack of a better term, they're just picky eaters, and. And oftentimes I'll have parents come in and say, it's sensory. Okay. Like, how do you know that? And so we start going through the questions of the sensory aspects of it. But, when we see sensory aversions, we will see some consistencies. So maybe they're adverse to chewy foods. Then the expectation, if it's sensory, is that across the board, they're not eating chewy foods. Or maybe it's that they don't like smooth textures. But if it really is sensory, if it's a sweet, smooth texture versus a savory, smooth texture, we should see the same thing if it's sensory wise versus the fact that they just don't want to eat mashed potatoes, but they love ice cream or whatever it might be. I don't know if that's a great example, but so I think sometimes we have to even look at the behavioral piece to this, because sometimes I think with sensory things, they may present initially, but we all can have a behavioral response to certain things. We have something that maybe we don't like, and then we change our behavior and avoid it. That may not be a sensory integration issue as much as a behavioral response of avoidance. So not to throw another complex piece into the whole picture, but it's part of our process of really doing good differential diagnosis.
And I'm curious your thoughts here, right? Like I'm trying to think of, actually, I would say it's more individuals in my personal life than professional, but when especially it comes to food, where they can recognize that there's a sensation. They're like, it tastes good. I get why people want this. Yeah. I just don't like the texture.
Yeah.
So does that feel like that kind of like that acknowledgement piece of it? It doesn't have to not be tasty or not be something like, hey, like if it was a different texture, yeah, I'd eat it. But like, it's because of this particular aspect of it. It just is something I'd prefer not to, or I tend to then, because of that, then behaviorally I'm avoiding it.
And I think adults are much better at articulating that, right? You know, it's like the 4-year-olds in our worlds don't really articulate it well, but it's really that becomes our job then. Let's really ask, like, do they ever eat smooth textures? Do they ever eat chewy things? Do they ever eat crunchy things? Like what, really, again, we use this word granular a lot, but we sometimes have to get granular in the questions we ask around these things, because it does make a difference. And maybe in some ways it doesn't diagnostically, but it does intervention wise. Absolutely does intervention wise. And, are we going to, if it's something that's attention related, oftentimes when we treat the attention, oftentimes through medications, we'll see that sensory thing go away. We'll see that hypersensitivity go away. That's not going to be the case with autism. No. Yeah, it's just not. And, so doing good treatments like good sensory integration or sometimes desensitization, understanding that granular piece is going to help us make better recommendations. So, but yeah, I think that's the idea. I think truly the sensory ones, it has nothing to do with taste. I've had people say that same thing and go, oh, I love the taste of chicken. I can't take the texture of it. Like, I can if it's ground up and it's really, really soft, but if it's just a chicken breast, I can't do it. So I've had parents who have, taken chicken breast and just grind it up in a food processor and make it for their kids. That's sensory. That's a textural issue, because grinding it doesn't change the taste of chicken breast, but it makes it something that's more palatable for that individual. So yeah, again, just going in a deeper dive, I think sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and, maybe if we're kind of jumping down on the list, this next one of emotional regulation difficulties. And, I think that this one feels apparent for both, but again, in differing ways. And I think that we can kind of tease apart this. So for emotional regulation, at least when I'm thinking of ADHD, a lot of it's frustration, and it's either I'm having, too big of a frustration response, or frustration is my go-to rather than kind of exploring some of these other maybe emotional dynamics that might be more appropriate or might be a better explanation. Where with autism, I hear it more of as a disconnect with the emotion. And it's like, oh, I know what this emotion is. I can express, like, I recognize but I'm not necessarily connecting it in that emotion, like almost reactive way, rather than it almost needs to be an intentional, responsive way at times.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is one where definitely see it in both. And sometimes there's a heavy overlap and really hard to differentiate based on this alone. That's why it is an overlap. But yeah, with ADHD, a lot of times I think it's more situational. Like, so in the sense where, again, when we get into these granular conversations with parents, we find a lot of times that their emotional regulation's okay.
Yeah.
And there are certain things that become overwhelming and frustrating. Whereas with autism, so I guess maybe we'll be more specific is maybe with ADHD, their emotional dysregulation is around doing homework at the end of the day. They're tired, they're overwhelmed, probably don't like school that much at times. Mm-hmm. And then they're coming home and have to sit still and do homework. And they have this emotional reaction of just frustration and overload. That's different than the transition of moving from doing one thing and moving to homework's different. I have kids with autism that academically are great. It's not the frustration of sitting down and doing the work. It's the transition from what I'm doing now to you're making me do homework. So again, getting into that, what's the reason? So, and I'll see a lot of times with autism that, it'll be more transitions in general, but it's not just around one or two specific areas. So I see those emotional dysregulations occur sometimes. I hate to use the word unpredictable, but sometimes they're hard to predict when those emotional reactions will have.
Well, and I think that unpredictable, or I would even say like inconsistent.
Inconsistent is a better word, yeah.
I think I see that present more with ADHD than autism.
Okay.
In a way, like where, hey, you were fine doing your homework Monday, Wednesday, same general situation. Yeah. And all of a sudden now it's like I have just like this big frustration and where with autism, the presentation might differ, but I think it's surrounding similar. It almost feels a bit more predictable, but that's more of my anecdotal experience with individuals.
Yeah, I think that's probably true with a lot of kids is that it's unpredictable, but yet it's consistent in what's causing the reactions. Yeah. This is really hard to tease out, but I'd say it's more specific where it might be one or two things. It's not every transition that throws them off. Yeah. I think with autism, it's sometimes the transition itself. So it doesn't matter where they're at or what they're doing. It's the transition in general that's difficult. And so, that emotional regulation, again, kind of difficult maybe to tease out, but getting to understand the function of it and to recognize that just looking at that symptom alone isn't going to differentiate the diagnosis because we might see it in both. But again, kind of getting in a deeper kind of dive with it's the most important piece of it.
Really, I guess maybe one last piece with that emotional regulation is like, I think regulating what emotion, but also to what intensity. And I do think that that's something that's a bit more common for both. But, when we're talking about that it's not only necessarily like, oh, well, hey, they're getting angry when they shouldn't be getting angry. But it's like, oh, hey, they're getting angry and it's like a 10 when this is maybe a frustrated 4, or hey, like it's really they're worried, but it's then being presented as anger. And so that, it's just that it's not necessarily matching the environment or the circumstance we would kind of expect to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So this next one, right, I think that we can really like sink our teeth into it a little bit more. And it's talking about neurodivergent communication patterns. And I'd almost like to lump in this next one here on this Venn diagram, which is also like webbed and interconnected thought patterns. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you view similarities, but also how do we tease it apart?
Yeah. So again, communication can look, different in both disorders. Like we do see those kind of unusual communication patterns that sometimes happen. I always look with ADHD, though, it is definitely that the communication challenges are more related to the inattentiveness or the impulsiveness. Where they're interrupting conversations maybe, or they're having difficulty following instructions, or you start on one thing and it cues an idea and they jump to another one and they're tangential, or they're not focusing really in the discussion. Whereas with autism, the communication patterns, I think, have more of a uniqueness to the communication pattern where, maybe that distraction isn't, going back to the old, was a Disney movie, Up, where the dog would see the squirrel and go squirrel. I see that more in communication with ADHD. Yeah. Like, maybe you're talking about one thing and it cues a thought and they go in another direction. Where with autism, that will happen. But what I find differential is that the tangential thoughts seem to have a more of a repetition, or they're taking the conversation more to their areas of interest. And I always say, I think it is one of the superpowers of autism is that how you can get a conversation about one thing and within a few sentences get it to go over to a conversation about what you want it to be about. And I've seen kids just be wonderful at that. And while that's a challenge, I think it's also unique to see how that sometimes works, where they can get you on that other thought. And I'm like, wow, how did we connect the dots from schoolwork to dragons and do it almost seamlessly? Brilliant sometimes. But it's different, right? Yeah. We see that where it goes through. Again, I had just a little guy in my office who was just turned 6. So younger kid, and his interests were trains, and, how in communication he could find a way to integrate trains into almost every conversation. And it was cool. Like, it was actually interesting to watch. And, it's functionally affects him because, socially we see it affecting how he's interacting with other kids. But also I looked at it and went like, wow, this is like, it was really noticeable that it was related more to a restrictive interest that was affecting his communication. So I think that there's just a difference in the uniqueness of the patterns of conversation with autism. And
I typically find that there can be more self-awareness with individuals with ADHD who find themselves, I did go off topic. Where individuals with autism, this is the topic, like that restrictive. It's like, sure, I don't understand why you don't understand why this conversation doesn't connect, where the individual with ADHD is like, oh yeah, well, you talked about this and made me think about this. And I remember this one time and and it's like, but they're able to maybe kind of come back and compare and contrast that initial to the end point of the conversation. Be like, we got off topic, where I don't necessarily know that awareness is always present for individuals with autism, at least that I've worked with.
Yeah. And I think also, when we're looking at communication, difficulties with autism, there's definitely, I think, a more clear pattern of kind of difficulties with that pragmatic language. Really that idea of using language appropriately within a social context. Yeah. I think it differs. And it's, when you see it, it's definitely more noticeable. Where, a lot of times with kids with ADHD, we don't see that necessarily. Again, they might get tangential. They might interrupt conversations. They may do all of these things, but in some ways, it still socially feels different. That makes any sense.
This next one, I don't know, is a surprise, for anyone who's familiar with ADHD and autism, which is executive functioning difficulties. And again, I think on the surface, they can present pretty similarly. Maybe it's, disorganized, but for ADHD, I oftentimes see that it's disorganization in a disorganized way. For autism, it might feel disorganized, but there's typically a system or a reason behind it, an intentionality behind it that I don't know that I always see with ADHD. And so even in that sense, I do think that we can maybe tease out these differences between, it might not be the most functional or optimized way of kind of going about things, but there might be a system in place that's kind of running underneath that, with ADHD, it's maybe, hey, I throw my stuff down and wherever it lands. And then I have to go take the time to go pick it all up because it's scattered everywhere. And that's just one small facet of executive functioning. But I think teasing apart these different dynamics and the functions, the functioning behind this executive functioning, again, we can start to then see the differences.
Yeah. And I think we can, with all of these, we're, kind of saying that. We can kind of see the differences in the two. But, it's very common, as somebody who does a lot of evaluations for individuals, if, I can't think of many cases in most of my career of either ADHD or autism where executive dysfunction wasn't part of those diagnoses. And it's so absolutely is a common overlap. Absolutely, we've got to look at that function. Again, the function really helps us more with that understanding how we're going to treat it. I think that it goes back to the intervention piece. But it's pretty rare that we wouldn't see those in cases. Maybe at very differing levels. I mean, I've had kids with ADHD whose executive dysfunction was pretty mild, and same with autism. Mm-hmm. Then I've had them with both disorders really severe, but pretty rare, if ever, do we not see some executive functions in some area. And I know that the idea of executive function is such a broad category. We're kind of lumping so many things in there. And, we've done episodes about that to kind of tease that out. But it's, I think it's definitely something where we can't say that somebody doesn't have either one of these disorders based on executive functions alone.
So, we're coming soon to the end of the overlap list here, but just a few more. And one of those being eye contact. I think a pretty common one that we see with both individuals. And I don't know, like, what do you feel like is the functional difference?
I don't know if they have a functional difference. I'm sure there is one if I thought hard enough, but I definitely think there's a qualitative difference when we're seeing inattention with ADHD versus autism. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think with autism, oftentimes I find the lack of eye contact being more controlled and predictable. So an example, I had an adult that I was working with who, we're going to talk, I think, about masking here in a second, but a little preview is he learned really good skills to look in the direction of somebody's face when they're talking, but he never could make eye contact. Like, he was always like kind of looking over my right ear. Like I could see him like where his eye gaze would go. And his contact was a more of a social avoidance for him. But he really worked hard through his life to make sure that it was, something that it wasn't as noticeable. Where with ADHD, I find that the eye contacts, because there's so many things in the environment that they're attending to, that they're trying to look at, that they're not paying attention. But we'll get more moments of good quality eye contact. So in between the lack of contact, we see it. So kind of a little bit more intermittent, I think, with ADHD. I don't think that's the case all the time, but I would say many times when I see it, it just qualitatively looks different. And again, as good clinicians, we're trying to understand why that's happening. With autism, it can be that way, but I find that it is either an avoidance for the social piece or a fixation on something else that and it tends not to be as random. Yeah. I've had, just think of a number of cases where I've had kids that just something in the office got their interest, and they would just almost fixate their eye contact in that direction all the time. And it was a very consistent thing. That looks much more in the autism spectrum than with ADHD. The kids with ADHD, they notice 101 things in my office, and they're constantly, asking questions about their eye contact shifting. So, I don't know functionally if there's a good differentiation, but it definitely qualitatively, I think it looks different clinically.
Yeah. Well, and, you shared that idea of masking, and I think this might be one of the most important areas, and even just as clinicians, to be aware of the fact that masking happens. And I think we can kind of tease out again why it might happen for an individual with ADHD, why it might happen for an individual with autism, having a similar driving factor there of, maybe not wanting to be rejected, but the way that the masking occurs, I think that's kind of how we can work to have a better understanding of like, okay, how do we then help? Again, driving the treatment and the support there.
Yeah. And I mean, and we'll hear different terms that I think are kind of used. Masking, camouflaging is another word that I don't think was part of this diagram, but that we were kind of talking through. But I think this is really important because I think oftentimes as clinicians, we don't recognize how hard people work to control their symptoms. And listen, we know that there are cases that obviously look like autism. And, there's not a lot of masking going on, and they're not hard diagnostic differentials. But as people require less support, over the years, we use terms like high functioning. I think of it's more of a less support kind of model, that they don't need as many supports in place. I think sometimes clinically we use that against people. And I mean, it's kind of weird to say, but I mean, I've seen doctors go, well, but he works. He works all day, so he can't have autism. He works and, interacts with people. But that's not taking into account that then he goes home and he is drained because he had to work 10 times harder to move through life than anyone else does. And that's where I see masking, is this idea that they learn skills to cover up some of their symptoms or to cope with their symptoms or to want to fit in differently because doing certain things maybe wouldn't be socially accepted. And then we say, well, because you're doing really well in a certain area, then it must not be this. And I think we do that with ADHD as well.
Yeah.
We'll say, well, they have A's and B's. 5 hours of homework a night. Everybody else is doing 30 minutes. I think this idea of masking or camouflaging, we see it with both. And I think some people, they're masterful at it. And again, as clinicians, maybe we need to ask really good questions to understand that and not make assumptions that just because they've done a lot of hard work to, for lack of a better word, fit in, that we somehow hold that against them and say that it's, we don't recognize what effort they put in. So, I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. I mean, I don't know if you have a different thought on it.
Well, and just, that effort that's required. It's, I guess earlier on in this week, I had a kiddo who came in and he's been doing pretty well. But he just came back from a trip abroad, and his mom was kind of like letting me know, like, hey, he just did not want to take his medication when he was with the extended family. And he kept coming back to this language of, but I can be good, but I can be good, but I can be good. And, mom's like, we know when he doesn't take his medication, like he's talkative, he can't focus, it's just all of these different things. And he and I were kind of breaking down, trying to identify more like, what does the medication truly do? Because it doesn't make you good.
Right.
What does the medication do? And I don't remember if this is something that we talked about here or I've heard in trainings, but I love the idea of comparing, I guess that the neurodivergence that comes along with ADHD as it's similar to height. There's nothing, we don't look at a short person and say, well, why don't you grow? But we might look at an ADHD person and say, why don't you focus? Right. We just give the short person a step stool, to make it more functional for them. And it's a tool, it's a resource that they need to have more readily available. And so I held a marker above his head and I was like, okay, hey, I want you to try to get this marker. And I held it where he could jump up and he could get it. But I also had it moving. So you had to time it right. It took him like 3 or 4 jumps to finally get it. I have a stool in my office. I was like, okay, step on the stool. Now try to get it. And I'm still moving the marker and he just reaches up and gets it. I was like, which one was easier? Well, with the stool. I was like, that's that gap that we're trying to fill here for you. It doesn't mean you're not able to. And that's, I think, the masking. You can get there. It just takes a ton more effort and a ton more work.
Right.
And how nice would it be if we can have support systems in place that just make it easy? You're just already on the level.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that, like, if we're not recognizing the masking, then we're just making people jump longer and, for a longer time and higher, rather than actually helping them develop the support systems that maybe can help close the gap there a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the whole reason of wanting to even do this kind of an episode is that I think a lot of times with neurodivergent disorders, we make assumptions without asking deep enough questions, and that can lead to us sometimes misdiagnosing because we do see some of these overlap symptoms and just jump to, they had a diagnosis of ADHD, but they're stimming and they don't make good eye contact and their communication's bad. Must also be autism. And we didn't ask enough questions to really help differentiate that. And I think on the other hand, we sometimes don't make a diagnosis enough because we make the assumption that just because they're able to cope with certain skills that they don't. So, I think misdiagnosis happens in both directions. Yeah. Sometimes we overdo it, and sometimes we underdo it. And there's, we need to really find that sweet spot, and doing a good evaluation or interview and recognizing these overlaps. And saying, okay, let's look at the reasons why we do see these behaviors are important in that. And sometimes, we gave some examples to help look at how to differentiate some of these overlaps. But, listen, there are people I see who I go, okay, we see all these overlaps and I'm still not sure. We see these overlaps. I can't differentiate it based on these overlaps alone. And, so then we have to really go, okay, what are the things that aren't overlaps and what really does separate these two things? And so I think maybe that's what we need to move into. Let's talk about, we talk about all these overlaps, but what are really the areas that really do help us differentiate more clearly? And again, we're going to talk about them as being different, but we may have people that do have both, which, this sounds such a confusing conversation, right? We're telling you, okay, these are how you differentiate it. But again, there can be comorbidities that people will have both diagnoses.
Yeah. And if we're able to make it granular, we can be more accurate with identifying if both is present, but it lets us better, I think if we take that approach that's more thorough, and we're going to be more accurate, even if it means that we're seeing both, or we're only, we're just accurately identifying one. So absolutely.
And it does help us then do better treatment. At the end of the day, I say often, I don't really care what we call things sometimes. I just want to know what do we need to do about it to help people out so that they're living the life they want to live. And, that's kind of how we have to view this is, we want to be accurate for that reason. So let's, I guess maybe Paul, talk about maybe one of the main differences we see is kind of, this diagram talks about craving novelty versus craving familiarity.
Yeah.
So how do you see it?
So for individuals with ADHD, I need something new or exciting or interesting to maintain my attention and focus. And if I don't have that, then it's going to be an uphill battle for me to attend. And that's where maybe come some of these other, like the stimming or, creating reward systems can be valuable, but it's like there's something that needs to almost be an external drive there that draws my attention to it. And that novelty or newness, I think is really enticing. That those limited levels of dopamine that are just being kind of naturally produced that then get, that are able to be produced in these various situations, novel experiences creates them more. It's easier to then create that pathway that says, oh, hey, new level in a video game, new gear, and video games are phenomenal with this because it's not a ton of time that you're spending doing the same exact thing. But if we tweak little bits of it, it's new and it's interesting. But I think that's an important part where with autism, going back to that, that conversation of someone who can bring it back to dragons or someone who can bring it back to trains. There's a couple clients that come to mind. Mario is a common one where it's like, we'll be talking about something And then we get back onto Super Mario Maker 2 and this level creation. And like, it's just that where I want to be at and why would I not want to be at this area. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really important distinction that we need to look out for. Not the fact that they're craving something, but what is it that they're craving? And
yeah. And I think I always look at, and I see this a lot when we're looking at kids that both may look distractible.
Yeah.
But are they distracted by the same thing that they want to go to, or are they, distracted by all the new things? Again, kind of that squirrel, it's this, wow, this one, I'm getting pulled in all these different directions versus, I want to just play Minecraft, or I just want to play whatever it might be. Like it really is this real familiar kind of comfort that they get into. It does look different. And again, sometimes it's easy because the familiar thing they want to do is so unique for that person. I had a young guy that I saw who was into vacuum cleaners. And his relaxation was to memorize the serial numbers of vacuum cleaners and memorized them back to like the 70s. Like you could tell him what vacuum you have and he could actually give you like the number. And it was just incredible, or this model number, I guess it was. And just fascinating to me. That was a familiar thing that was really obvious. It doesn't take, many people to go, okay, that's a unique thing that we're seeing much more with an autism spectrum often. But I also have kids that it might be Mario Kart, where, I have ADHD kids and I have, kids with autism that have the same interest. But again, are we doing it because of the familiarity of the game and the almost repetitiveness of the game versus another reason? So I think, again, we have to try to differentiate the two, but those are, I think, that idea of familiar things versus novel things is, I think, really an easy thing to look at.
It's really interesting. My ADHD, usually my ADHD kids, but it's certainly also adults. When I change something in my office, I might get like a new game or I might move something around, it's pretty quickly. They're like, oh, you got a new game. And I'm like, I didn't even like, how are you even seeing it? It's like behind something. And they're like, oh, well, that's, that moved. And so like, and versus there might be something like someone where it's like, oh, hey, like if I'm working with a child with autism, they're coming in and we're talking. And then the parent comes at the end of the session, like, oh, hey, you added this. It's like, oh, I really wasn't attending or paying attention to that. So it's like, what am I going to that's familiar and what's important to be familiar and what's, what are all the new stuff? Yeah, no,
it's funny because I just moved a few months ago, moved the couch around in my office. And, I think both kids with ADHD and adults with ADHD and autism both noticed it. But the kids with ADHD noticed it for different reasons. And it truly was a new experience for them. Like they came in and things were in a different place. So they were touching new things. They were doing things. And some of the individuals I see with autism still haven't gotten used to it. And they come in and I don't know, we're probably 12 weeks out of me making this move. And they still come in and they go, I don't like your office this way. I didn't change the couch. I just put it in a different situation. And it's still the topic of conversation. It's the exact same. It is still not familiar to them after 12 sessions. And it still bothers them. And I have to sometimes explain, like, there's a reason why I had to do it. And we go through it. But that they had been in that other office for a while and now it's different for them. So,
yeah. Well, and, kind of going along this, like the differences that are here, this next one that's on the list is with ADHD, difficulty regulating attention and focus, and with autism, finding comfort in repetitive behaviors and routines. And I think that's, certainly rearranging things. I think that really talks to that finding comfort piece of it. It's like, okay, if I can be in my routine, if I can have these expectations, it works really, really well for me. Then go back to that talk of the transitions, why it's so difficult, because this is comfortable and change is hard. Where with individuals with ADHD, it almost feels, that regulating attention, there's constant change. And so we're just hoping that the change circles back around to, the intended topic or focus often enough that we're able to make progress with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one I think is really interesting, because I actually find while kids with ADHD probably could benefit from finding comfort in some repetitive behaviors and routines, they don't like them. They actually find it very difficult. And it's why we try with all the executive function training and all of those things. It's that's difficult. And now some do, don't get me wrong. I mean, I have some that eventually get into routines and go, wow, this is really great. It's made my life easier. And they learn to find comfort in them. I think that's different than just finding comfort in them.
Yeah. It's the result of it versus the action of it, I believe.
Yeah. It's a great way to differentiate it.
Yeah.
I guess moving on to these other ones, the next area is, how's it different with kind of social cues? So, with ADHD, this idea that difficulty with social cues is due to not focusing on them or not attending to them, versus difficulty with understanding cues intuitively, that we just don't understand the idea of sarcasm. It's not because we didn't pay attention to what you said. It's that we truly don't understand those cues. And again, I think it's a qualitative difference that we see in the two.
Yeah. If the attention is directed at the cue, I think individuals with ADHD, they get it. We're just rolling the dice if it is or it isn't. And so going back to the social deficits, oftentimes in relation to the attention piece versus what individuals with autism, it's that either a very specific language that needs to be used, or okay, well, hey, you might be looking at your watch and checking your phone and looking around and starting to walk towards the door, but you haven't said that you have to go, so I'm going to keep talking. Like that kind of I'm looking for a very specific cue, and if it's not there, then I'm going to continue in my comfort activity or my comfort zone.
Yeah. And again, I think that although I think there are times with both conditions we can have moments of better social interactions. I don't think, I definitely think with kids with ADHD, that their social skills feel like they wax and wane more because of the attention piece. And man, sometimes they're the most charismatic and social kids. And other times they're just so dysregulated that it looks like they're not, even though they are. And again, I've had children on the autism spectrum that we can see some variation in certain areas. Their social skills are much different or much better, but there are times that I think as a whole, we see their understanding of those social cues being different. But if we go back to how these things, we find certain routines. Like I have a teenage guy that I work with off and on. And, he's found the world of Dungeons and Dragons and loves it. I mean, it's been phenomenal for him. And it's been a wonderful social experience. And his mom videotaped, which I know is probably not cool for teenagers, but his mom was videotaping this Dungeons and Dragons group he belongs to. And he looked socially wonderful in it. It was awesome. I actually was so appreciative to actually witness and see his interactions, because I was like, wow, he's really doing great there. But it was an area that he was really comfortable in. So it was a great opportunity for him. Those social interaction skills don't transition or generalize to other aspects. It's almost like when you see him in other social situations, those difficulties just aren't, intuitive. He just cannot pick up on those cues where in the right setting, his skills look stronger. Yeah. Very different, I think, than what we see with ADHD.
Yeah. So, kind of rounding the corner here, but two more that I think that we can really differentiate. This first one being individuals with ADHD, hyperactivity and impulsivity, individuals with autism, strict adherence to routines. I feel like we've been saying that in a variety of ways, but that's just plainly put, individuals with ADHD, they're going to, they're not going to think before they act, and they have a lot of acting that they want to do. And those individuals with autism, I'm trying to gear it towards what is the thing that's familiar and what is the thing that I can find comfort in that familiarity.
Yeah. And again, I think, we've used this idea of qualitative differences. It does look different when they're either one or the other disorder. If we really only see one existing in an individual. But again, we also have to watch. We can have hyperactive kids on the autism spectrum. That happens. We can have high impulsive kids on the autism spectrum. But most often, if we will see a way to differentiate that if they're not coexisting conditions.
Yeah. And then this last one, inhibition difficulties for individuals with ADHD, and the high need for verbal context for individuals with autism. Ray and I were talking before this episode, and we were like, these ones don't necessarily connect. They're kind of standalone, which is probably a good thing. Like we want some standalone pieces.
Right, absolutely.
And so for that, going back to the impulsivity with individuals with ADHD, it makes sense why those inhibitions are going to be lowered. It's, what is going to be most interesting, what's going to be, maybe that give me that dopamine release, and, my lower levels of GABA are stopping me from stopping and thinking, what's the cost of me, speeding down the road because I'm late for something versus, individual without ADHD might be like, it's worth getting there 5 minutes late to not get a ticket. Or, turning down a substance, or, making healthy decisions surrounding romantic, like just those different pieces where that stopping and thinking piece can be really important.
Yeah. And I think that, when we talked earlier about executive functioning, this is the executive function that I definitely think is a differentiating factor. Yeah. I mean, when you see the inhibition, ADHD definitely is at least got to be on your radar pretty strong. We see it, I think, probably the most often. It's not on this Venn diagram, but I would say for me, the other executive function that I would have probably countered here is, I see the difficulty shifting in mental sets being much more prominent in the autism spectrum. Again, they can both occur, but if we're really trying to look at where do we see differences, I see that difficulty shifting or transitioning be an executive function. It's much more prominent in those with autism than I do with ADHD. Again, can co-occur, but probably the better differentiator for me that I see.
Yeah. And I guess the one that they do have here for autism, the high need for verbal context. We were kind of sharing some different pieces there before, but just that, like, almost a literal, or the need for a literal communication versus sarcasm or colloquial terms, or, just different, like cultural terms that are being used. And if it's not in their repertoire, or if that's not what the meaning that they have assigned to that word, there's not a ton of flexibility with it. Yeah.
And, I shared this with Paul, a young guy that I was doing an evaluation with, and one of the rating scales, which I think probably should be changed, but they used the phrase, I feel blue. And he was completely confused. Like it was the wrong, and he was going, what do you mean I'm blue? And I never would feel blue. And I kept trying to explain it. And I was like, well, it's just another word for sadness. And he's like, well, why don't they just say sadness? Like, why are they saying blue? And I, honestly, it was probably 15 minutes that we're going through this one item. And it was interesting because we eventually got to the right context for him. And he went, the movie Inside Out. Like, is that why the one character, and he gave me the name of the character, why she's blue, like the color blue, because she's sadness. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, well, then if I'm angry, do I say that I feel red? And because the anger guy was red. And I was like, well, I guess there are people who say they see red, but and that kind of refers to anger. And I just got down a path that was a path I probably shouldn't have gone down, but it was interesting. And I was like, wow, like, how simple that wording is and how many, this is a test that's normed for kids his age. And I don't know that I've had anybody struggle with it that much, but for him, it just didn't, the context, colors mean very different things to him than emotions. Like it was something very different. So, again, I think that's a much more common path that we would see on the autism spectrum than with ADHD.
And I think one thing that I think it's unfortunate for children on the spectrum is that I think bullying has the potential to then almost take on like an even higher experience of the bullying. I have one kiddo who kids at school call him emo. And he's like, I'm not emo. And like, he gets angry because I'm not emo. If you look at me, I'm a gamer. I'm not emo. Right. Emo kids are blank, 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 blank. I'm a gamer. I do blank, 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 blank. I'm not emo. And like, I think but they meant it as an insult initially, but now it's like, again, going back to that emotion regulate, it escalates. Yeah, and so, again, that strict adherence to this is what this word means, and I don't meet that context. Why are you calling me this?
Right.
And that the nuances of like, let's try to understand why. It's like, well, why would they use that word? There's other words they could call me that would be mean and accurate. Right.
Like, it's not the meanness; it's the accuracy that bothers. That's kind of it's interesting. But I think with all this, I mean, I know talking about these things, I think sometimes it does feel confusing with all this overlap. And I mean, I think the reason I'm glad we kind of did this episode is, I think clinically we have to always, good clinicians, kind of step back and making sure we're looking at everything and trying to understand the overlaps. And again, sometimes we can't understand them. Sometimes it's really hard to differentiate. But our goal in the end is to be accurate. And, so we want to avoid making assumptions about behaviors being one thing or the other, because there are those overlaps and we need to treat those overlaps with, I think, some integrity to really, again, getting granular with trying to understand them. But also, I think, avoiding making assumptions, because we also want to, just because somebody stims, it doesn't mean it's autism. And that we owe to I think the people we see, to go through and evaluate these things thoroughly enough that we can help answer the right questions. And, don't want to just jump to one diagnosis or the other. And I think the more we get this information out, and this goes back to our, I think, TikTok episode, it's wonderful that we have all these resources now, like these diagrams that are online. But sometimes a lot of information causes people to make assumptions that we don't want to make. And it's our job as clinicians, I think, to help differentiate and to help educate people and to say, you do some self-stimming. That's okay. And it is part of your ADHD, and here's why, and here's what we can do to help you if that bothers you. So, maybe we need to do more episodes like this to tease things out. And maybe there's not perfect answers, but being thoughtful about them, I think, help us all be better clinicians.
Absolutely. Well, and with that, I think that's all we have this week. We hope you join us next week. But until then, be well, stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.